So let's get to today's program. I want to, of course, thank our friends of the library for their generous support for today's program. And just in case you're not familiar with our speaker today, after decades spent traveling the world and picking up university degrees from Jerusalem, Harvard, and Geneva, Dr. Ron Brown settled in New York City in 1992. He's been teaching history, ethnic studies, and political science at Touro University and world religions at the Unification Theological Seminary for over 25 years. He has been deeply involved in the cultural life of New York City through his work as a featured speaker at the New York Historical Society, New York Council for the Humanities, and numerous other libraries, historical societies, colleges, and universities. And we welcome Dr. Ron Brown today as he begins a new series of programs about New York City neighborhoods. Today, he's going to take us to Central Park. So a day in the park as we start to see the first signs of spring. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ron Brown.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. And as usual, it's wonderful to be back here. It seems like just last week that I was here the last time, you know, that time goes by so fast. Well, yes, Touro College, where I've been teaching since the early 90s, is now a university. We were Touro College for many, many years, but then as a college starts having more and more MA programs and then PhD programs, it's entitled to take on the status of a university. So as of last week, I am now a professor at Touro University. And I asked my dean, does that mean my pay is going to go up? And he just laughed. So that was the answer. So, well, today we're going to be visiting Central Park. Well, we are at that transition phase where it is no longer covered with snow, but I was there a couple days ago, and some of the areas you saw the first hyacinths pushing up, the first tulips were coming out of ground, you started seeing buds on certain plants. And so that's really what Central Park was about when it was planned by Vaux and Olmsted. Every time you went to Central Park, it was a different park. The trees and the plants and the flowers and everything were purposely planted so that every time you went, something else was blooming, something else was happening. So even if you go in the early spring, which I love, I mean, you see the beginning of the first lilacs starting to come out with their buds, while other trees are still totally sleeping from the winter. So once again, this is the outline. New York City in the 1850s, when Central Park was first conceived back in the 50s. Why was it conceived? What was happening in New York that necessitated a park? Then the central role of Thomas Cole. Those of you who are interested in painting know about the Hudson River School of Painting. Then the real impetus for building a park was the Civil War rich. All of the people who made a fortune in New York because of the Civil War. Ironically, New York City and the surrounding area never once voted for Abraham Lincoln. The New York area hated Abraham Lincoln. In fact, they say that when he came to New York, it is in New York that he grew his beard so people wouldn't recognize him. But yet, New Yorkers made a fortune during the war. The rise of Fifth Avenue, and then what was lacking in New York of the Gilded Age was a magnificent park. And then finally, the transition of the park from a park of the elite to the park of the people. So what was going on in New York in the 1850s? Well, the one thing that was happening was New York was growing in population. In 1830, it had a mere 200,000 people. By the Civil War, it had reached 1 million. So the city was growing. On the left, you see New York City in the 1830s, gradually pushing up Manhattan into the new laid out grid plan. And then on the right, you see not only New York, Manhattan, but Brooklyn, Queens, and New York City expanding up the spine of Manhattan. Well, what kind of people were causing this explosion of population? By the 1830s and 40s, the two largest groups flooding into the city were Irish Catholics and Germans, both of them despised by the old English and Dutch Knickerbockers. They despised the Irish because they were Catholic and they were flooding into a predominantly Protestant city. Everybody hated the Germans because they didn't even speak English. So who wants all of these foreigners flooding into the city? And so that was the period when the 5 Points area was an area of gang warfare. Slums and tenements, people sleeping on the streets. There was no sewage system. You threw your garbage on the street. In the 1830s, it was illegal to kill a pig in New York because pigs were the walking garbage disposal. So you threw your potato peels, you threw your pot from the toilet just into the street. You whistled and the pigs came running for breakfast. So the pig was a sacred animal. Well, if you didn't have pigs, you were going to have rats, and rats spread more diseases than pigs. So by the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, New York was filling up with people, but of the lower classes. Gang warfare. You ever watched the movie? I'm sure they have it here. The Gangs of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio, a fascinating depiction of New York in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. People like Thomas Nast depicted the Irish coming in as crocodiles sent by the Vatican in the distance. You see the Vatican to take over America. By taking over New York, turning it into a Catholic bastion, they could link up with the French in Quebec, the French and Spanish in Florida and Texas, and take over North America. So the Irish were despised. Well, as if the Irish and the Germans flooding into the city were not bad enough, New York was also a cesspool of disease. Cholera killed thousands of people every year. Well, nobody really understood these ancient diseases which had plagued humanity forever. In the 1830s and 40s, these diseases simply came and nobody really thought that you could do anything to stop them. Today, we know that cholera was spread by polluted water. But back then, the water was rainwater. You got it from a pump on the street if you were lucky. And nobody ever imagined that polluted water caused cholera. So the people simply died by the thousands every year. The pandemics of 1840, 1 million died in Russia. London, 15,000. In Great Britain, 52,000. Mecca, the sacred city of Muslims, 800,000 died in Vietnam. 150,000 died of cholera in the great pandemic of the 1840s. Nobody knew what caused it. Most people just accepted it as the hand of God. Well, along came a person named John Snow in Britain, and he took a scientific approach to cholera, and he discovered that all of the cholera cases in London that killed thousands of people were centered around the city pumps. If you lived far away from the pump and you relied on rainwater or river water, you didn't catch cholera. And so what he did was, as you can see from the sign there, Dr. John Snow, he said, well, what happens if I take the handle off of the pump? Suddenly, cholera disappeared from the streets of London. And so people started taking a scientific approach to disease. Cholera was caused by polluted water. Influenza was caused by polluted air. It was spread through the air. I love the little poem. I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. The discovery that influenza was spread through the air, like tuberculosis, it was spread through coughing. And here we have the great influenza pandemic, once again spreading around the world and ravaging places like the 5 Points. When there was a cholera or an influenza epidemic in New York, the city simply hired wagons with drivers to go around every morning. The driver would yell out, "Bring out your dead." They would drag out the dead bodies, men, women, young, old, children, throw them on the wagon and bury them as quickly as possible. Tuberculosis, another disease spread by the air. It was called the White Death because as tuberculosis, back then it was called consumption, and you gradually withered away and the blood deteriorated and your skin turned white. The Seaview Tuberculosis Hospital on Staten Island, as last I heard, was still standing where they would isolate them. But it was only slowly that people started realizing that polluted water and polluted air caused these diseases. So people like Thomas Cole started saying, well, if polluted water and polluted air are causing these diseases, maybe we can do something about it. Well, Thomas Cole, as a Hudson River painter, was fascinated by the landscape. In fact, he's called a landscape painter, a paysage in French. And he just extolled the virtues of the country life. Well, it was trees, it was little brooks, it was grass. And he was a firm believer in good, healthy country air. He believed in the power of nature, that all these immigrants flooding into America, the Dutch and the English and the Sephardic Jews and Africans who were already there, with the Indians, the Irish, the German Christians, and the German Jews flooding into the city, he believed that nature had the power to transform people. When we talk about countries, so many of the countries have a name that it is a group of people combined with a land. England, what's England? The land of the Anglo-Saxons. Holland, Thailand, even in Israel. The correct name of Israel is Eretz Israel, the land of the people of Israel. Israel is a people, Eretz is the land. So Thomas Cole firmly believed that if people could interact with nature, fresh air, fresh water, trees, flowers, even animals, that the most devastating ravages of slums and crime, tuberculosis, cholera, influenza, and other diseases could be overcome. Nature had the power to cleanse. I grew up on a farm in north central Pennsylvania, one of 8 children. And I remember when my mother had her first baby when she was 20 and her last when she was 50. And we convinced her to stop because we had enough Christmas presents to buy every year. So I was number 3. So I was already growing up and had to change poopy baby diaties and all that kind of stuff. And I remember once my little brother was out crawling around in the grass in the backyard and he came across some bugs or something and he was eating them. And my mother said, oh, let him eat the bugs. It'll either kill him or it'll make him strong, because that was nature. And I won't tell you what else my little brother was finding in the backyard, because we always had animals running around. But it was nature. It was good, healthy spring water. My mother had a spring up this road from where we lived, and that's where she got the water to make wine and beer, because she didn't like the beer that she had in the United States, and she had her own way of making wine, but she used good, healthy spring water. So it was the land, the healthy country life that would create new Americans and make them good and strong. Well, once it was discovered that polluted water was the source of cholera, in 1837, the city fathers started building the famous Croton Reservoir, which brought water from upstate New York, north of Westchester County and up there, the Adirondacks, huge tunnels underground, bringing it down to the very first New York City reservoirs, which are still in the middle of Central Park. So you can say that Central Park didn't begin as a park, but it began as a giant reservoir. Today it's called the the Kennedy Reservoir. Well, today, the central part, which you see the central and the one in the middle, that is the reservoir which is still there. The square ones on the left are no longer there. So you can say that the first step in building a park was building the reservoir. And the reservoir itself was constructed in 1842. Now, there was a second reservoir which went down to what is today 42nd Street. You know where the New York Public Library is? That was where this magnificent reservoir, which you see on the left, was located, right on Fifth Avenue, built in the Egyptian style of architecture. On the right, you see where New York City water came from back then and continues to come from. The great watersheds of upstate New York, the Croton watershed, the one at Catskill, Delaware watershed, bringing water down in these giant 10-foot wide diameter, giant tunnels, going the whole way down to the first reservoir in Central Park. So New York today has the healthiest drinking water in the world. It is untreated largely, and it comes from an area in the north. I know a friend of mine was up there and he went hiking in the watershed and he was arrested for peeing against a tree. And the cops, the people in charge said, you are polluting New York City's water. So if you do go up there, find an alternative place to relieve yourself. Well, the Hudson River School became one of the biggest proponents of not only fresh water and fresh air, but they gave the inspiration for building a giant park in the middle of Manhattan. Asher B. Durand, this picture on the right. Most of these paintings of Thomas Cole and Asher B. Durand are at the New York Historical Society, really a treasure house of these landscape paintings. And you see the typical trees and the flowers and the little creeks and the lakes, which were so celebrated by the Hudson River School. So the scene was set for a park. And by the 1850s, the city fathers were not only building the reservoir in Central Park, but were making plans for a giant park in the middle of Manhattan. Don't forget, Central Park is the largest park in the world, completely inside a city limits. Most of the big parks, like the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, is on the part of it is in the city of Paris, but a big chunk of it is outside of the city limits, whereas Central Park is completely in the middle. Well, if you look at the map, you see New Amsterdam with Wall Street and Broadway. Gradually, New York City spread northward. On the right, you see the commissioner's plan for the grid plan of Manhattan of 1807. There is no park. That little white spot that you see, that is Washington Square. And that was not a park, that was a parade ground for training the New York State National Guard. So as late as 1807, there were no plans for parks, but the impetus came in the years leading up to the Civil War. All of these immigrants flooding into the city fueled the industrialization of New York. A lot of you probably remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. New York was the textile center of the world. Cheap cotton produced by slaves was brought north. The textile factories of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York and New Jersey fueled the industrialization of New York. So you had the industrialization of New York, which is fueled by all these cheap immigrants flooding in and getting jobs in factories. Certain people started getting rich. John Jacob Astor, who when he died in 1848, was the richest man in America, the first multi-millionaire. But the Civil War filled New York with millionaires. Commodore Vanderbilt, who died in 1877, he was a multimillionaire. He was called Commodore because he got his start building ferry boats between his hometown in New Dorp, Staten Island, and Manhattan and Brooklyn, and gradually expanded it into a group of ships, and then ended up adding railroads. Because of the Civil War, he became a multi-millionaire. Carolyn Webster Schemerhorn Astor, once again, English, Dutch, and German, really began the transformation of Fifth Avenue into the street of the Civil War millionaires. On the right, you see her mansion. You know the story of her dining room, 400 people only, no Catholics and no Jews permitted. So when she finally died in 1908, a group of secret businessmen bought her mansion, tore it down, and revealed that they were the trustees of Temple Emmanuel, and built Temple Emmanuel on the spot of her mansion, which would admit no Jews. Sort of poetic revenge there. Well, Mrs. Astor began gathering these Civil War millionaires, intermarrying with them, such as the famous Vanderbilt family. And gradually, because of the Civil War, a very powerful class of what we call American oligarchs started emerging, all of them making their money during the Civil War. A.T. Stewart migrated from Northern Ireland, developed the very first department store, and by the time he died, in 1869. He was one of the richest men in New York, built his mansion at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. The Vanderbilts built their mansions along 5th Avenue. You see two of them standing there. Commodore Vanderbilt, I think, had an average of 15 children, it is believed. And when he finally moved to New York from Staten Island, whenever one of his children would get married, he didn't want to show favoritism. So he built each of them an identical mansion on 5th Avenue. It was called Vanderbilt Row, and there you see two of the mansions. So he didn't favor one over the other. They all got the same mansion. Well, 5th Avenue was growing. It was the Astor family, certain of the great mansions, which are still standing, such as the ones on the right. You see a couple of smaller one-family mansions of the Gilded Age. They were called gilded because they were gold on the outside, but don't ask what was underneath that gold. They were simple farm peasants from Staten Island. They were new immigrants. They were people whose origins you really didn't want to know about. Corner lots were preferable. These are two of the 5th Avenue mansions which are still standing of these Civil War millionaires who were gradually filling up 5th Avenue. They built their houses of worship. Ascension Episcopal, First Presbyterian, even the Catholics got into it with St. Patrick's Cathedral, the first 5th Avenue Temple Emmanuel in 1868. Once again, built by the fortunes of the Civil War. The Lehman family, one of the biggest slave trading families in the pre-Civil War South. Following the collapse of the Confederacy, the family moved to New York, invested in their money in Wall Street, and became one of the main sponsors of Temple Emmanuel. Again, another Civil War millionaire family. They built hotels, Peninsula Hotel, Tiffany's, Plaza Hotel. 5th Avenue was the reserve of the wealthy. Private clubs. My favorite is the one at the top in the middle. That's the Yacht Club. You see the back end is the ship. You had the Union Club. You had the University Clubs. You had the Harmonie Club, which was the German Jewish club, because Jews weren't allowed to join the good clubs. So as soon as the German Jews built their club, they said, but only German-speaking Reform Jews, none of these Orthodox people from Russia. And so they became as exclusive as any other club. Monumental buildings were going up. The first Metropolitan Museum, the first New York Public Library. The wealthy Civil War millionaires were very proud of their wealth and their power. But there was only one thing that was missing, and that was a monumental park. Every city in Europe had its beautiful parks. The park behind the Palace of Versailles in Paris, the park behind the Louvre in Paris, the magnificent parks behind the palaces of St. Petersburg, of Vienna, of Rome, of Lisbon, of London. But who built these parks? They were basically the backyard of kings. The Jardin Luxembourg, my favorite in Paris. You see the Palais Luxembourg in the front, and behind it are the gardens, once again built by princes, dukes, barons, kings, and emperors. Well, the problem was New York, we didn't have a royal family. There was no Baron of the Bronx. There was no Marquis of Manhattan. There wasn't even a queen in Queens, to say nothing of kings in Kings County. So we didn't have royal palaces. We didn't have royal gardens. So this was the one thing that the Civil War millionaires were lacking. There was no Jardin de Luxembourg with its gardens, which the king or the duke would open his gardens certain days, certain Sundays, where he would allow the aristocrats to promenade in his Jardin de Luxembourg. Well, of course, around the garden, the gates were opened, but there was a policeman at every gate to make sure you were properly attired. Formal attire only to go into the jardin. No plastic cups with coffee, no paper bags with a sandwich, no walking on the grass or, God forbid, picking a flower. But New York had none of this. So the wealthy of Fifth Avenue convinced the city fathers to carve out a giant park, just like in Europe. They hired Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, who were the most famous garden and park designers of the era. In fact, the father of Central Park was Andrew Haswell Green, who was also the father of the consolidation of New York, where the 5 boroughs came together. In fact, he's not very much appreciated because he was always the power behind the idea. But he was the one who hired Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux and inspired them to design a park that could be just as beautiful as anything that the kings and the emperors of Europe could design. Well, the first big question was, what kind of park? Is it going to be a French park, such as the one you see on the left? Everything is symmetrical, straight lines, triangles, parallels, squares, and circles. It was the French who decreed that God didn't know what the hell he was doing when he designed a tree. Trees are supposed to be square or round, and none of these branches going every which way. The French invented the hedge, where you cut it where it is square. Whereas the English said, no, God knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe I should say what she was doing, or maybe to be even more politically correct, what they were doing when they designed nature. So you see the contrast between the French and the English park. The English is natural. Let the tree grow the way it wants to. The little creek can meander through with a little pavilion up on a hillside, trees just celebrating nature. Whereas the French said everything had to be symmetrical, square, round, geometric. Well, this was a big debate that folks in Olmsted and the city fathers had to debate. And the debate was vicious. Well, the park, once again, was a park by the rich for the rich. It was originally founded in 1857 as an expansion around the reservoir, but it was only after the Civil War that it really took off. Well, the rich along Fifth Avenue, the Civil War millionaires, said it's going to be a park like in Europe. There's going to be gates everywhere. The one you see here is the Scholars Gate, which is the one I always go in when I take my students from Touro University on a walking tour. We go in the Scholars Gate. Well, like in Europe, when the park was being built, each gate had a policeman. You had to be appropriately dressed. The parks were closed on Sunday. Where should every good Christian be on Sunday? Definitely not strolling in a park, which meant basically that back then you worked 5 days a week and usually the best part of Saturday. So the park was basically for the exclusive use of the wealthy. You could rent a carriage, which was a sign of a certain status, or you could bring your own personal carriage, which showed what ignored, who you greeted with a nod of the head, who you greeted with a wave. All of the different levels of society had a secret code. But the park was important because that is where you showed off your beautiful daughter, hoping to attract the attention of somebody's good-looking son. And so it was a way of the wealthy meeting the wealthy. The park was officially completed and declared open by 1873. On the map on the left, you see the park. The Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir is still there. The square part of the reservoir, which is today the tennis courts and the North Meadow, is gone. But if you look at the pathways, you see that it is a typical English park. There are no straight lines. Everything is irregular, even the lake. Even Jackie Kennedy Onassis Reservoir is an odd-shaped thing. Harlem Mere is a strange shape. Hills, crooked paths. These are nothing more than bushes because the area was largely uninhabited except for a small Seneca village and on 8th Avenue near the Museum of Natural History. And so all of the trees and the bushes and everything were purposely chosen and planted. So there's not one tree in Central Park that goes back to before the 1870s. So you get a totally artificial environment, but created to look natural. Now, in the middle of the picture on the right, you do see a straight line. You see 4 rows of trees. That was the concession to the French park. So the English won 95% of the park and dominated it, but 5% was given over to the French. That is the mall, which is a beautiful part of the park. So the vast majority of the park is what we see here, the rambles. I have adopted a family of raccoons that lives in the rambles, and Mommy Raccoon knows me. And so I can go there and sit up in the rambles hidden away, and I take peanuts and things like that for Mother Raccoon, and she'll come out, and she always brings out her babies, which are born about this time of year. But if anybody else comes up, she runs away. So she thinks I'm a raccoon, I guess so. But it is a totally English park. The famous Belvedere Castle, 67. When they say that the temperature in New York City, or the wind in New York City, or New York City had 3 inches of snow, that is measured at the Belvedere Castle. In the bushes beside the Belvedere Castle, there is an entire area given over to all these electronic things that measures wind velocity, rain, snow, temperature, and everything. So the next time you hear that New York temperature is such and such, it is always measured at the Belvedere in the middle of Central Park. The famous Bow Bridge, built during the Civil War. In New York, the New Yorkers never voted for Abraham Lincoln, but yet they built Central Park during the Civil War, something that Abraham Lincoln wasn't too thrilled about because he said you should be getting involved in the war effort and raising funds for the war. But the New Yorkers say, no, we'll just make our park. The lake, once again, you see the change of time. The Bow Bridge photograph was taken in early spring. This is the pale greens of early spring. The lake on the right is the fall colors. Anytime you go, the park is different, a different flower. Along the mall, you have the famous Walk of Wisteria, which is absolutely magnificent, but when it is blooming, it is filled with tourists. But once again, you see the lake and the Bow Bridge and everything, they are natural shapes. They are irregular. They are natural English parks, except for the mall, the straight lines leading down from the statue of Christopher Columbus and William Shakespeare. The mall is lined with the great writers of the English-speaking world, down to the band shell and the summer stage, continuing on to the Bethesda Fountain, overlooking the very irregularly shaped lake. This is the concession to the French. It is straight lines, trees in rows, hedges are pruned, everything is geometric. The beginning of the mall, you see the Christopher Columbus statue, which is still there. You see the statue of Beethoven, composers, and other composers along the walkway of the mall. The Bethesda Fountain is the only part of the park that was designed by a woman. Emma Stebbins, 1873, designed the Bethesda Fountain. I'm sure you all know the story of Bethesda in Jerusalem, where Jesus' famous gospel story. According to legend, Jewish legend, there was a pond in Jerusalem called Bethesda. Beth means house. And an angel would come down periodically, and when the angel's wing touched the water, the first one in the water would be healed of whatever disease he or she had. And so this is at the very end of the mall. Beyond the mall, if you look at the picture on the left, you see the famous Boathouse, where they have the gondola, which is a sight to see when there's a big wedding and all the boats are going out into the lake. The Boathouse has public toilets, which is very important, and they're free, but it also has 3 restaurants. I say the super expensive, the less expensive, and the simple expensive, but it is still a wonderful part. In fact, I was taking some students by there and they had a big area and they were having a wedding. And so they had 2 tables out before you went into the restaurant. One had glasses of white wine and one had glasses of red wine. Well, evident for that moment, I guess the guy who was in charge of the wine tables had gone in to get something. So I told my students, I said, hey, free wine. So we all went up and everybody had a glass of wine and we were standing there in our shorts and tank tops and stuff. And the guy came out and let's say his Spanish was not very appropriate for the occasion, but we got the clear message that it was for guests only. But of course, we had already finished our wine. I even got 2 glasses of red, so. But one of the pleasures of walking in the park. Now, the park was being built during and especially after the Civil War. Back then, they didn't have these big riding lawnmowers. So if you have a big open area covered with grass, how are you going to cut the grass? Well, that's where the sheep meadow came into play. The sheep meadow is still there, but the sheep have been probably consumed long ago. But it was a very popular thing for students as a summer student job to go to the park early in the morning, and they would be assigned a herd of 20 or 30 sheep, and they would say, okay, take your sheep up to such and such a place and let them eat the grass. Well, part of the job was, well, you know, sheep, grass goes in the mouth, and we know what comes out the other end. Well, what came out the other end was not sheep poop. It was priceless fertilizer for the plants. And so your job was to pick up the sheep poop, put it in a bag, take it back with your sheep, and you were paid for your day's work. Now, the picture on the left, if you look closely, you'll see that the trees are still relatively young. I mean, they hadn't started really filling out like they are today. Once again, to bring nature, to bring fresh water, to bring fresh air, to rejuvenate the degenerate population of New Yorkers in the 5 Points, Hell's Kitchen, Lower East Side neighborhoods. Part of it was to interact with nature. Of course, not on Sunday. And of course, if you were properly dressed, you could stroll through the park. The dairy barn actually had cows. And for 1 penny, you could take your kid up. They would get a little glass of fresh milk from the cow. Well, and I went there and I told my students, and one of my students says, "You mean milk comes from a cow?" You know, I mean, they had never seen that. You know, that's actually where milk comes from. God didn't create it in little plastic bottles in the grocery store. But that was part of this. New Yorkers couldn't go to the forests of upstate New York or Long Island, but you could bring the healing effects of nature into the city. Not only the fresh water in the reservoir, but fresh milk. You could see animals grazing. You could get the fresh air. And it's a nice thing about Central Park is you can be isolated somewhere in the Rambles and you just completely forget that you're in New York City until you look up and then you see a skyscraper overlooking you from Central Park South or the 8th or 5th Avenue. But back then, the area around Central Park was totally desolate. In fact, one of the very first buildings on 8th Avenue was the famous Dakota. And why was it called Dakota? Because when they built it, it was the only building on 8th Avenue along Central Park. And people says, my God, to move up there, I may as well move to Dakota. Because back then it was still the Dakota Territory. There wasn't North and South. So that's how it got its name. The zoo, once again, bringing animals into the park. The very first zoo at the bottom corner at 59th and 5th Avenue dates from the 1860s. Planned during the Civil War and then really taking off after Civil War. With a famous Delacorte clock, get there every time on the hour or the half hour to see the animals going around. They had the famous polar bear, Gus, who recently passed away. And they have, especially for children, baby animals. So when Mommy Duck has her babies, they bring the whole family down. And you see all kinds of other animals with the babies which is a great thrill for children. Well, from the beginning, it was a big battle whether the park was going to be not only French or British, but also whether it was going to be a park by the elite and for the elite, or whether it was going to be a people's park. Well, gradually, the wealthy gave up their control of the park. The policemen disappeared from the gates. They started allowing people to walk on the grass, but do not pick the flowers. The Shakespeare Theater and garden was built. Once again, the gardens are fantastic because every plant mentioned in Shakespeare's plays or sonnets or poems is present in the Shakespeare garden. And they will have a little metal marker saying, this is what this plant is, and it is present in this particular sonnet. And so it is a wonderful thrill on a hillside, and to the left of it is the famous Shakespeare Theater, which is free, but you have to, these days, you have to go online and hopefully reserve a ticket to visit one of the presentations. But there you can see the trees are already growing up, they're filling in, and gradually the park was surrounded by skyscrapers. Famous Boathouse, 1870, began as an exclusive restaurant for the wealthy, and then gradually it became more and more popular, and now you can pick up your drink and just walk through the park, something which was forbidden initially. Tavern on the Green dates from the 1880s. Once again, this sort of Tudor rustic style, just opposite the Sheep Meadow. The Sheep Meadow today, as I said, it has no more sheep, but it is a quiet area. No frisbees, no radios, no loud talking. It is enclosed in a fence, and it is patrolled. If kids make too much noise or people are listening to music too loud, they will be asked to either tone it down or leave. So they maintain a silent area. The Bethesda Fountain area, once again, you can see from the balustrade on the picture in the upper left, you see it's perfectly symmetrical. 2 flights of stairs going down on either side, the round fountain in the middle inside of a square with this fountain and the statue of Bethesda in the middle. That is an extremely popular area for weddings. In fact, it's a big business where Asians love to come to New York and have a big church wedding, even if they're Buddhists or communists, doesn't make any difference. They have a big church wedding, and then they'll go to Central Park at a particular season to celebrate their particular flower. Here you see it's probably a cherry blossom or a crabapple blossom, which means it is an early spring wedding. Almost every time I go there, there's some kind of a wedding going on. No music is allowed, no food is allowed for the wedding, but photographs are heartily encouraged. Now, I made a mistake when I said there was only one French part of the park. The second part is the famous Conservancy gardens, which were added in 1937. Once again, you can see it is typically French. You have a little grassy area on either side. You have 1 row of white flowers, 1 row of purple flowers, a little memorial in the middle. On either side, you have geometric patterns. Each season, the flowers change. The one on the right, you can see it's early spring because of the delicate green, and you see the tulips in the foreground. Well, as soon as the tulips wither, they are taken out and replaced by some other flower. They are brought in full blossom. They will often last no more than a week, and they are removed and replaced by still another flower. And that is another concession to the Frenchies along Fifth Avenue. The John Lennon, who was assassinated there, you can see it with the Dakota behind him with Yoko Ono. That's where he was assassinated. That is a memorial just inside Central Park opposite the Dakota. He was assassinated in 1980. And the mosaic on the ground is Imagine, of course. And I've never heard that lovely song massacred as many times as I've had when I've listened to Chinese guys with a guitar trying to sing Imagine. I mean, but yet they make a good effort. And you see people just there giving flowers and writing poems in honor of John Lennon. From what I heard, Yoko Ono still lives with her son in the Dakota, just across the street. Well, as the park became more and more popular and the wealthy Fifth Avenue gilded people lost their power, the park became more and more of a people's park. You started having baseball diamonds. You started having playgrounds for kids. You had areas for playing the pétanque in French or the bocce in Italian, the lawn bowling. In fact, lawn bowling has a long history in New York. You may have heard of, at the very, very bottom of Broadway, the bottom of Manhattan, is the famous Bowling Green Park. That was for lawn bowling. And it was surrounded by one of the oldest remaining structures in New York City, and that is the iron fence around the Bowling Green to keep the pigs out, because they would go in and root the soil looking for grubs and roots. And so the fence around Bowling Green has survived all of the fires and everything which have ravaged lower Manhattan. So lawn bowling is a major part of New York history. So this marked the beginning of the popularization of the park. Events go on there. Famous Hanukkah on Ice in lower Manhattan, sort of trying to bring some Christmas spirit to the Hanukkah holidays. Dalai Lama, the flags, Simon and Garfunkel in Central Park. A lot of different areas have taken on their own specific character with the popularization of the park. In the Rambles, there are certain areas where nude sunbathing is tolerated. And when I walk through there with my students from Toro, half of them are Orthodox Jews, you know, it's amazing how many come up to me afterwards and say, now, which area did you say was the nude sunbathing area? And there was an area where, since time immemorial, pot smoking was tolerated, and you'd see guys and girls sitting on a park bench smoking pot, and the cops walking by and not doing anything, as long as it was in that particular area. There are other secluded areas where more than pot smoking is tolerated, and where nude sunbathing sort of goes to stage 2 of activity. But I won't tell you where that's at. You can ask me afterwards, and you know. So the area has become more and more popular. Now, of course, a lot of you probably remember Central Park back in the 70s, when it was really declining and had become very, very dangerous. It's not that way anymore. I mean, sometimes I'll be at the Historical Society or something, and I'll just cut through Central Park, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And as long as you stay on the main paths, it is safe. But I was there, this is a couple of weeks ago, and I ran into this Italian couple, young people, and they were totally lost in the park, which is very easy to do because it's an English park. And so the paths curve and go up and down and right and left, and you never see straight ahead very far. Well, they were totally lost. And I said, well, where do you want to go? And they said, we want to go to the subway. I said, well, probably the closest is 72nd Street over on 8th Avenue. And I said, I'll walk you over there. Well, of course, we were going up the hill and down the hill through a tunnel over the bridge and everything. And they started getting worried. They thought, my God, where is this guy taking us? We're going to be raped and murdered and robbed and everything. And finally, we got there and I said, okay, right up there is a subway station. I never saw people so relieved. I mean, they thought, my God, we're still alive. And they thanked me and everything. But it is very safe, and it is really one of the marvels of New York history. As part of the Civil War, wealthy, and then gradually its democratization of the city. So, as my book there, How New York Became the Empire City, I mean, having a park, just like the great cities of Europe, was really instrumental in making New York City a city that could rival London, Rome, Madrid, Paris, and St. Petersburg, making New York into the Empire City, which it has always aspired to be, ever since George Washington called it the Empire City. Okay, thank you very much. So,
thank you very much, Ron. That was terrific. I know it's pretty chilly out there today, but thank you for taking us to the park today. We do have some questions here in the chat, which I'll get to, and then if folks here have questions, we're happy to take those. One of the first questions here, Ron, is regarding the topic of Abraham Lincoln, and whether New York City did really dislike Abraham Lincoln or not. This person asks, I've read and seen a couple of programs that said New York made Lincoln president. His journey to the presidency actually started with his speech at Cooper Union. So any more thoughts on the popularity of Abraham Lincoln in New York City?
Well, the reason why he was so viciously disliked in New York was because the old Knickerbocker families, these were the English, the Dutch, and the old German families, as Mrs. Astor personified, controlled the banks, they controlled Wall Street, they controlled the business establishment, the insurance companies, they controlled the Brooklyn Naval Yards. These were all controlled by old families. Well, then as soon as the Civil War broke out, they went belly up because half of the plantations in the South were owned by New York banks. The cotton industry was controlled by New York businessmen. And these people feared desperately that they would go bankrupt, and they did. The Irish Catholics of New York never voted for Abraham Lincoln because they said, if we give freedom to 4 million slaves in the South, they're going to show up in New York and even work for less than the most lowly of Irish Catholics. So neither the election of first election or his second election, New York and the surrounding area never once voted for New York. The factory owners of New York along the East Coast, especially the textile industry, was built on dirt cheap cotton. They would not be able to compete if they had to pay a decent wage for the cotton. So all these people basically went belly up, and it was a whole new generation of people who took over. Heinrich Steinway, you may have heard of him, commonly called Henry Steinway. Well, he wasn't making pianos during the Civil War. He was making cannons and bayonets and rifles. Friedrich Augustus Otto Schwarz, mercifully shortened to FAO Schwarz, was not making toys during the Civil War. He was making railroad cars. He was making all kinds of new industries. The Commodore Vanderbilt, a dumb farm kid from New Dorp in Staten Island, ended up becoming one of the richest people. The Lennon family, very rich slave traders in the pre-Civil War South, liquidated all their slaves, moved to New York, established the Cotton Exchange, and became big investment bankers in New York. So a whole new crowd of people emerged following the Civil War. It was really a big change. The battle between the Astor family and the other old families and the new families was very, very bitter. So New York, at neither of the elections, voted for Abraham Lincoln. Now, that means the city of New York, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, but upstate New York voted overwhelmingly for Abraham Lincoln. Now, the one thing Abraham Lincoln did in New York was to grow his beard. And there's the famous story. He had very bad skin. It was pockmarked. And there was a little girl who at one of his speeches here came up and said, 1873 it was completed. It was Vaux and Olmsted who were the designers. It was Andrew Haswell Green who came up with the idea. Yes, thank you. So that was the situation. New York was extremely complex during the Civil War. Yes.
Great. Another quick question here. You had mentioned the Scholars Gate. Where exactly is that located?
At 69th Street and 5th Avenue. So when I come in from Queens, I take the R train, which is local, and it stops at that corner. That's where the, right across, kitty cornered across from the Plaza Hotel. That's a corner. That's where they also rent the carriages. So it always smells like horse poop, you know, but it's a very convenient location.
So you have your hand up
Yes.
there?
The Irish also were being drafted, and they couldn't afford the bounty that the wealthy people could pay and get out of the draft.
Yes, that's
They
another,
also- yeah.
that's a very, another chapter of New York during the Civil War. New Yorkers and guys from rich families did not fight in the war. In fact, it was tradition during the Civil War, and it was legal, that you could hire a replacement. And so the wealthy fathers would hire farm kids from Pennsylvania or upstate New York or Connecticut or Long Island to come in and take the place of their son. Now, they did have the famous Silk Stocking Regiment of New York, and they were of the rich kids. But they would march in parades. They'd go to Washington and were very famous. They never shot a gun in their life. They didn't know which end of the gun the bullet would come out. But that's why they were called the Silk Stocking Regiment, but they never fought. Now, you bring up another chapter which is very important in the American Civil War in New York, were the famous draft riots of 1863, which were not draft related at all. They were race riots where the Irish, basically the Irish gangs, decided that they wanted to let these slaves who were, if they got their freedom, they wanted to convince them that New York was not the place to go. So in July of 1863, riots broke out. They burned the African Orphan Asylum, which was on Fifth Avenue at 42nd Street. They burned African American churches. The African school was burned. And half of the African Americans of New York City were driven out of the city. And that's where large numbers settled on Long Island. The majority went to New Jersey. And so even after the Civil War, when the slaves got their freedom, they knew the one place to avoid at all cost was New York City. And these are the famous draft riots, as they're usually called, but they were really race riots. Very, very bloody. Yes, we have a question.
Hold on one second. There.
But I just wanted to ask you, because I couldn't see from back here, thank you. The map, where is the mall? Where are those two places where the French, yeah, I would think.
Let me run back here to the map. Whoop. Okay, there's the mall. Now, at the bottom of the map, you see 59th Street. And then on the right, you can still see 72nd Street. Okay? So if you go in the 72nd Street, you will come directly. That's one of the paths which doesn't meander too much, and it goes out on 72nd Street near the Strawberry Fields. It cuts through the park. And that is where the mall is. Okay? And you can see it cuts diagonally through there with the fountain up on the lake and then going the whole way down to the mall. In fact, the mall has become rather controversial because they, for the first time, added statues of women and African Americans. It had been men the whole way through. And I think the statue of Christopher Columbus is still there, even though that is controversial. Shakespeare, we saw the Beethoven, and the great poets of the English language are on that mall. So it's really wonderful. And then another thing too is the trees which you see are the famous elm trees, what they call the American elm tree, which formed a canopy over the street, over the mall. Well, the elm tree, long before the COVID pandemic became popular, there was the Dutch elm pandemic, which swept the world, killing off the elm trees by the millions, whether they were in Europe, the Dutch variety, or the American elm tree. And the mall prized its elm trees a lot. My father worked for the Department of Agriculture for many years and was involved in developing a vaccine. He didn't say anything about a booster at the time, but a vaccine where he could vaccinate the elm trees against this disease. And it was developed by the University of Pennsylvania. And he was involved in that because he so valued the elm tree. You still see a lot of towns on Long Island which prize their elm trees. There's what was that famous horror movie, Nightmare on Elm Street or something like that? You know, they were a magnificent tree, not growing upwards, but spreading over, forming a canopy, as you can see quite here. A lot of the elm trees have been vaccinated on the mall and are holding on, but it's hard to tell how long they will last. Yes, yes.
Gilded Age on Fifth Avenue, I guess it was the Astor time. Who were the masons that built those beautiful, mansions? Was there a group of skilled masons that did all the architecture and stuff?
Oh, yes. The construction, it's interesting. Most of the builders came over from Europe because the Gilded Age, as I mentioned, meant you were gold on the outside, but who knows what was on the inside. A lot of these people, like Commodore Vanderbilt, like John Jacob Astor, who was a bit before that, these were ordinary people who became fabulously wealthy. They didn't know how to spend their money. They didn't have good taste. Commodore Vanderbilt would go to a restaurant. I mean, he was a meat and potatoes and a stein of beer type person. And his wife didn't know how to furnish a beautiful mansion. Tiffany was the very first person, American, and he was French, to bring culture, to teach people how to dress. Famous story of Louis Comfort Tiffany. You know, we think of him as lamps and stained glass windows, but he did everything in the interior of the home. Famous story, I don't know whether it's true or not, but one of the Astor girls was getting married, and the Astor family hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to arrange everything from the wedding. That's what was written into the contract, everything. He was supposed to design the table, design the dishes, get special glasses, bring the right wine, have the right food. Everything was his job. So he was there, and the wedding was getting started, and the bride, one of the Astor girls, came down the giant staircase. He looked, and he said, "What in God's name are you wearing?" He said, "You hired me to design everything for the wedding, and said, 'This is your wedding gown. Get back up and put it on.'" Oh, I'm dramatizing it, and I don't even know if it's a true story, but it shows that these wealthy people brought over French to teach them how to live. The one mansion I showed you, the A.T. Stewart Mansion, was a scandal because it had what they called the mansard roof. You know, the sloped roof on the top floor. That was designed by Monsieur Monsard. In France, they name, if you invent something, they name it after you, okay? And so it was called the mansard roof until now. There's another story in France that the guy who came up with the idea of having a garbage can on each street corner that was attached to the floor, that the people would come around and empty it. You know, it was a big invention in France, and so they named it after him. And so his name was Monsieur Poubelle. And so today, a garbage can is called a poubelle. So could you imagine, so be careful what you invent. I mean, you know, it will be named after you. But the wealthy people brought over French designers. They would hire people to scour the mansions of Europe, find a family that was on the verge of bankruptcy, selling statues, selling everything. In fact, during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, it was a gold mine for Fifth Avenue, because France and Germany were at war. Many of the towns in France were occupied. So they would go, they'd buy all the statues in a church. They would find some castle where the baron had been driven out. They buy everything at cut rate value and bring it over and furnish their houses. So very often the person who lived in this beautiful mansion had no taste whatsoever. I mean, they would go to a restaurant and the menu was in French. They would have to have a secretary beside them to translate it. So, I mean, this was, that's one of the reasons why they're called the gilded people, because they had no pedigree. Only the children would get some culture. And then, of course, their children of the Vanderbilts, for example, you know, they started getting some class. And then they would send their daughters, because the only thing they were missing was not just Central Park to be a royal class city, but they needed royal titles, which in the United States are forbidden by the Constitution. And so the Vanderbilts would send their eligible daughters with a couple suitcases filled with gold bars to find some impoverished baron in London, marry him so he could put a roof on his castle finally, and the daughter became the Duchess this and the Duchess that. And so these were called the dollar princesses. Okay, I mean, there are whole movies about them. You know, the Consuelo Vanderbilt was probably the most obnoxious. In fact, she collected titles like people collect Hummel figurines or something. You know, I think she had married 5 times and was each time a different royal title. So, but that was the situation of the robber barons, the gilded people of the post-Civil War period. People changed their names. Okay, Augustus Schoenberg, a German Jew, changed his name to August Belmont and went into the horse racing business. And to further improve his status, he even converted to the Episcopal Church. And somebody asked him, they said, well, what's this, a Jew converting to the Episcopal Church? And he said, well, actually, no. He said, I converted from being a non-practicing Jew to becoming a non-practicing Episcopalian. So, you know, but that was the world of the Gilded Age.
So I have a couple of questions just on the chat on Zoom here, and then I'll get to ones back here in the room. So Leslie DiCamillo, I see you have your you've had your hand raised for a while, so you should be able to unmute. You're still there and have a question. Okay, we'll come back around to you. Stephen Duncan, I also see you have your hand raised for a while. You should be able to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, Ron, I was wondering what you could tell us about, there's an outdoor bronze sculpture at East 67th Street and Fifth Avenue. It's a commemoration to the 107th Infantry. It's a memorial there. Have you seen that statue?
Oh, yes, I think that's a silk stocking.
I can't hear you. You're away from the microphone.
Thanks for your patience. We're using multiple mics.
I think that is the 5th Regiment Memorial.
Right, it's the 107th Infantry Memorial, and it's near that Scholar's entrance to Central Park that you mentioned. But this 107th Infantry Memorial is at East 67th Street and Fifth Avenue, right there at Central Park. Are you familiar with that sculpture? It's a beautiful sculpture commemorating World War I and the soldiers that fought in it.
No, I'm not familiar with that one. The one I was thinking of is on 8th Avenue. But, okay, there are a lot of memorials there, and that one must be for the, as you said, for the First World War Memorial. Yes. Yes, they're putting up more and more memorials all the time in Central Park, not just along the mall, but in other places. Yes.
Yeah, but I'm just pointing it out to your viewers and listeners because it is a beautiful sculpture and everything, and it has like different soldiers from a particular battle in World War I, and the sculptor himself was in this particular battle, and it's a fabulous sculpture because it shows soldiers, launching forward, fighting with their bayonets and things like that, and they're carrying other fallen, their comrades that have fallen. One is dead, one is dying, and things like that. And it's just a fabulous sculpture, and you can see it online also. Anyone who's interested in seeing it online, again, if you look up 107th Infantry Memorial, it's really fabulous. And when you see it in person, it is breathtaking. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Okay, we're going to take a question here in the room.
I think we had one over here and one here. Yes.
You talked about the Stewart Mansion, which is 34th Street and Fifth Avenue. That's where Altman's department store was later. Was it in the same building, or was it a different building?
It's a different building.
It is?
Yes. That's really the fate of most of the mansions of Fifth Avenue, because these mansions were one-family houses. And if you look at them closely, you'll see that along the top, they're usually smaller windows, and that was for the female staff. Now, after the Civil War, people still had horses and buggies. So if you had a Fifth Avenue mansion down around First or Second Avenue, they still have a lot of the carriage houses. which have been transformed into apartment buildings or houses, but you can always see the big door going in. And that's where the male servants lived. The horses were on the ground floor and the male servants were on the upper floor. And that was really one of the big distinctions between who was at the top and who was lower down. Did you have your own carriage or did you rent a carriage for the day? One of the more interesting stories of the Gilded Age, the Civil War, was Madame Restel, who, when all these young, 17, 18-year-old kids were arriving in New York to do their military training, and knew they were going to be marching off somewhere down the road to the south, and this might be their last wild weekend, Madame Restel was there to provide them with certain amount of female entertainment. And she developed it into her own industry, publicity. To have a Restelian during the Civil War was to have an abortion. And she had her products, and she had her magnificent mansion on Fifth Avenue with her mansard roof. She had the most luxurious carriage, which changed every year. Every summer it was a different carriage. But for some unfathomable reason, the good, wealthy families of New York shunned her. Now, nobody knows why for sure. Scholars are still debating it. Well, eventually she just, actually at the time, she was the wealthiest woman businessman in New York, one of the very first self-made women. Well, she ended her career with slit wrists in her marble bathtub, which was the size of a small room. And that was the end of Madame Restel. So I forget what your question was. I go off on a tangent. Yes.
I had read that all the department stores along Fifth Avenue, such as Altman's, had on Madison Avenue was the carriage entrances for people who came that way so they could go in the other way.
That's part of it. But also most of the, that's another chapter of Fifth Avenue, a lot of the stores had a history of before the Civil War when they were producing like Brooks Brothers, was producing men's clothes, made a fortune in making uniforms for the officers of the North. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a Brooks Brothers coat. And when you go to see the memorials in Washington, they show him coat and it's open. So you can see the Brooks Brothers seal. And then after, of course, they moved to Fifth Avenue and they made it big during the Civil War. Yes, I always say Civil War is great for business. So, yes.
Just one sec. Let me.
Okay, just a second.
Thank you. The Frick Museum on
Yes.
Fifth Avenue, what did the Frick family do? Or is that,
that's-
what was their background?
Okay, here again, we had the pecking order on Fifth Avenue. And Frick was a steel magnate along with Andrew Carnegie from Pittsburgh. And the Fifth Avenue elite, we talked about the Knickerbockers, the old Dutch and English and German families losing power because of the Civil War. A whole new group came in, but they were exclusively Protestant and Jewish. No Catholics were allowed on Fifth Avenue. And the Frick family was a big Pittsburgh family. The Carnegie family was a big Pittsburgh family that moved. My mother's cousin, Charlie Schwab, was the president of Bethlehem Steel, the largest steel producer in the world up until and after World War I. Well, he was a fervent Catholic. And when he wanted to build his mansion beside his good friend, the Fricks and the Carnegies, he was not allowed to build on Fifth Avenue. So he had to build his house up on Riverside Drive, the Charlie Schwab Mansion, the largest private house ever built in New York City, over 50 rooms, was built up on Riverside Drive with a view of the Hudson looking toward his hometown in Pennsylvania. And the Catholics were banned from Fifth Avenue. The Jews and the Protestants intermarried, like the Belmont family. They said, well, nobody went to church anyways. So if I convert from being a non-practicing Jew to a non-practicing Episcopalian, who's going to know the difference? But you could never be a non-practicing Catholic. And so they were never permitted on Fifth Avenue. Mrs. Astor, in her list of 400, finally relented and admitted 2 single Catholic girls to her list of 400, but they had to sign a contract before they were allowed in her front door that they would marry Protestants and any children that were produced would be raised Protestant. So there was, in the eyes of Catholics, this Jewish Protestant mafia ruling Fifth Avenue, and Catholics were excluded. So when my mother's cousin, Charlie Schwab, when cousin Charlie finally died, he wanted to give his mansion to the city of New York as the mansion for the mayor. And the city said it would cost too much to maintain. So it was eventually torn down and they settled in that hovel, which they call Gracie Mansion today. So the world of Fifth Avenue was really rather cutthroat.
So there's a couple more questions here on Zoom. Shelley Middleton, I see you have your hand raised. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I remember in the 60s, early 70s, I was not allowed to go walk into Central Park because it was said to it was dangerous, it was unsafe. Don't go in there. Now I'm understanding that it is lovely, it is safe, it is beautiful, it's comfortable to go in there. What accounts for the difference?
Yes.
Shelley.
Did you all hear the question? That during the 60s and the 70s, Central Park was very dangerous. Well, one of the big changes was the establishment of the Central Park Conservancy. And that was a group of private citizens. I forget the woman's name. I met her. She was a docent at the New York Historical Society with me for many years. And she founded the Central Park Conservancy. And it was basically a citizens' movement. They raised money to restore the benches, to restore the buildings, to restore a lot of the infrastructure of the park, to hire security people to go around. And so Central Park gradually became more and more safe. And so by the 80s and 90s, it was safe. But they did discover something, that when the park was neglected, if there would be a storm and a tree would fall over, nobody came to clean up the tree. And there were branches all over the place and everybody was complaining. But they then discovered that as the trees would rot, bugs would go in, and the bugs attracted birds. And so when Central Park was nice and clean and everything, there were very few birds there. But because of the neglect of the park, more and more birds started migrating through Central Park, realizing there were all these dead and rotting trees everywhere, just filled with lunch, breakfast, and dinner. And so Central Park really, now when it goes there, if a tree falls down, they leave it down. Now, so it became safe by the 80s and 90s. Now, today, because of COVID, Central Park has still another chapter. The police don't patrol the areas where you go nude sunbathing, where you smoke pot, where you go to have fun. And it has become, and my friends describe it as an orgy, because the police don't enforce any of these rules. And the logic was, well, if you're in lockdown, you're wearing a mask, all of these restrictions, where you can go, Broadway shows are closed, movie theaters are closed. So one place you can go, and these are mainly young people, I've heard, that they go there and they have an absolutely wild time in the park, and the police don't bother anybody. So I've heard some really wild stories about the park. So
We have another question here. I think. Do you have a question?
Well, I was gonna, yes, if you're lost in Central Park, I guess the lampposts have the street numbers on them. Like even is
Yes.
the west side or the.
yes,
or-
there are some signs, but the problem there is you'll see a sign, but then the path, you see the path. And the thing about the English Park is you can be standing here and you see the path goes down here and then it disappears. You don't know whether it goes off to the right or off to the left, you know, because it always looks like a dead end. Whereas in the French Park, you can see exactly where you are going. So it is very, very easy to get lost. And a lot of people still have the memory of Central Park back in the 60s and 70s when it was dangerous. And when people come over to visit and I say, well, let's go on a walk in a Central Park, or even when I take my students, I'll get calls from their parents saying, is it safe? Because that memory of those years when the park was extremely dangerous still remain with a lot of people. Yes.
So there's a few more questions here in the chat. What of the attempted destruction caused to Central Park by Robert Moses?
As far as I know, he didn't attempt to destroy Central Park. I know he planned a big highway through Greenwich Village, which was never went through. Too much popular opposition. His highways were the east side and west side, the Bronx cross Bronx Expressway. But I'm not aware that he ever had any plans to destroy the park. Could the questioner, do you have some information on that?
Sure. So that was from Gail. If you have any more information, go ahead and type that in the chat. Another question just related to what you were just speaking about in terms of the trees in Central Park. Were all the trees in Central Park planted, or was the park planned around existing trees at the time?
There were no existing trees, because back in the period before the Civil War, people used wood to heat their houses, to make water for a bath, to cook. And so Central Park was literally chopped down completely. There was a farm area. In fact, if you look at the map, which is up there, you see where there is 72nd Street up near Strawberry Fields. That is over there is where the Museum of Natural History, Historical Society, that was farmland. There was the Arsenal, which is one of the few buildings in Central Park, which is down near the zoo on the left-hand side. And that was where the National Guard did its training. In fact, during the Civil War, large parts of Central Park were used for military training. Now, the person who asked about the highways, a point that you can see on this screen is you can see there is a road that goes across Central Park. See the zoo on the right-hand side, the black buildings? Just above that, there is a highway which goes across Central Park. That was the 65th Street transversal. And there are, I believe, 3 major highways that connect the east side with the west side. These are for cars. Very often they are either in a tunnel or they are in a pit. So, and surrounded by trees. So if you look at that highway going across, you can see it's broken up into sections. And that is a section where it's underground, going through a tunnel And then when it's above ground, it is completely shrouded on both sides with trees, which very often cover over it. So you can walk through the park and you won't even hear the cars and the buses cutting through Central Park, which might be a reason why Robert Moses saw no major reason to transform it, because east-west traffic was built into the plan of the park, because you can't really block off that entire section, Middle Manhattan, and ban traffic. So there were three, I think there are transversals, they call them.
Okay, just one or two more here. Are the gardens in Central Park on par with the Bronx or the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens?
No. The Bronx Botanical Gardens and the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens are specifically botanical gardens. That's their emphasis on magnificent plants. They'll have their shows of orchids and different Christmas displays of plants and stuff. That's their specialty. Central Park is a park. Now, there are certain areas which do have beautiful flower beds and flower arrangements, but the flowers of the park were basically to make it so that no matter when you went, from the spring when you'd have the crab apples and cherry blossoms blooming, to the wisteria period, to the tulips period, and then to the fall flowers blooming, it is part of an overall park experience, not a botanical garden experience, which is very different.